Some of the things certainly that have been on our minds up at the Jepson School have been our renewed attention to community, our greater sensitivity to things that truly matter in our lives, our appreciation for things, people, and places that we previously may have taken for granted, and our hope that we come to a greater understanding of the importance of commitment to something greater than oneself. A greater awareness, too, that our lives are intertwined with distant others in ways that maybe we had not fully recognized before the events of last year. At the Jepson School of Leadership, we do try to give a great deal of thought to the kind of leadership and the kind of citizenship that we hope all of us are thinking a lot more about in this past year. In our confusion, we call upon people like our visitor this evening to help us reflect upon these things, and we are fortunate that Paul Loeb is here to help us. Paul has spent 30 years researching and writing about citizen responsibility and empowerment, asking what makes some people choose lives of social commitment while others abstain. He has written 4 widely praised books and lectured to enthusiastic audiences at over 250 colleges and universities throughout the country. He attended Stanford University and New York's New School for Social Research and worked in both places helping to end the Vietnam War. From 1974 through 1976, Loeb edited Liberation magazine, where he worked with writers like Grace Paley, Todd Gitlin, John Berger, Jane Jacobs, Allen Ginsberg, Noam Chomsky, and Gary Snyder. It's good company. Loeb's first book, Nuclear Culture, explored the daily world of atomic weapon workers in Hanford, Washington. Hope in Hard Times examined the lives and visions of ordinary Americans involved in grassroots peace activism. Generation at the Crossroads, Apathy in Action on the American Campus, explored the values and choices of American college students. Soul of a Citizen, Living with Conviction in a Cynical Time, looks at what it takes to lead lives of social commitment despite all the obstacles. This last work has been the subject of numerous discussions among the students at the Jepson School. It raises issues that are timeless in a democracy, but especially timely for us today. We are grateful that Mr. Loeb has agreed to raise our level of understanding of the obligations and responsibilities of citizenship. Please join me in welcoming him to our community.
I've had a rather full day already of good discussions in this community, so I'm looking forward to this furthering that tradition. It's kind of an honor, I think, to speak on this day that is so different from many others in our history. And I was thinking about it on the plane coming in, and thinking about what, as many of us have, I think, what's changed, what hasn't changed, the kind of new issues that have been thrust in our face, the just shock and horror that most of us, almost all of us, felt a year ago watching those planes fly into the buildings, and thinking about how all of us work for justice in a time like this that maybe isn't the most easy of times. And one of the things I was thinking of the lessons, I'll talk a little bit more later directly about it, but the lessons of that day is just the kind of profound interconnection that all of us felt. The people who were up there, the rescue workers, the firefighters, the police officers who gave their lives that day, were doing it because of some kind of human connection. When we watched and we heard the stories of people we never knew, or maybe only remotely knew, we felt a connection with their lives. And it seems to me that it's not a challenge that came out of that time because it preceded it, but one of the central challenges we face is a kind of a struggle between what I would call the gated community of the heart, which is a kind of ethic of disconnection, an ethic that just says we're separated, we have no common responsibility, whatever happens to somebody else is not anything that we have to pay attention to, and the notion that we are profoundly interconnected, and I would argue even interconnected to those men whose murderous rage killed those 3,000 people, and whether we like it or not. that choices of ours have played some role in bringing them to that awful and terrible state. So I think part of the challenge, I think, is how to look at that world. And one of the things that struck me as I was thinking again about just the day is the difference between the people whose lives we value and the people we render invisible. And I can't say that I feel I know every person who died on the World Trade Center, but I read story after story. I saw people talking about them on the news. Their lives became flesh to me. They became real. They had weight. I remember just earlier this summer, you may have, as I did, followed the story of those Pennsylvania coal miners who were trapped and then miraculously rescued. And you felt like you knew them. There was a kind of immediacy. And I started thinking about all the people we never even see, never even imagine. There's a very respected site, organization called Bread for the World. It's a hunger relief group, an activism group. And I went to their site shortly after the World Trade Center bombings and attacks, and they mentioned that 30,000 people die each day of hunger-related causes, 2/3 of them children. 30,000. I can't wrap my mind around a number like that. I don't know if you can either. But then I started thinking that it's basically 10 times the World Trade Center toll every single day, day after day after day after day after day. And yet their lives feel not very real to most of us, invisible. One thing also they said on the site that was for about $13 billion we could prevent this. And they compared to the amount, they'd had it up before the attacks, the amount that Americans spent on pet food each year. Or about 1/7 of the amount that the wealthiest 1 in 100 Americans will be getting after the tax breaks that Bush passed shortly before the World Trade Center attacks. Or about 1/30 of the defense budget. I started thinking, well, why don't we demand that we address ills like this? I was on a panel this afternoon, some wonderful community leaders, talking about all the kinds of desperately underfunded, struggling, and wonderful efforts to help connect us to each other in this community, to meet the needs of Richmond, to catch the people who are falling through the safety nets. Why aren't those lives real? And it struck me that one of the challenges, and I talked about this a little this afternoon, is that the stories aren't told. They aren't given flesh in the way that the people who died at the World Trade Center are given flesh. And so part of the challenge to me is to take the magnitude and horror of that cataclysm that all of us witnessed and let it be an impetus for us to raise those harder questions, and I'll come back to them later, about our relationship with our fellow human beings, about what a world of justice would look like. One of the other reasons I think that we tend to avoid looking too hard at those invisible faces is that we feel like we can't do much about it. Maybe that's the biggest reason. I'm not sure. Certainly, as I've interviewed people over the years, I've heard again and again people say, well, I would really like to. And the like to can extend from anything to these huge global issues to some community here in Richmond that you want to help, or dealing with some small and local environmental issue or some huge global environmental issue. And then the shrug happens and the hands go like this and people say, I don't know how. And I've begun thinking over the years that we're, in fact, not taught to act as citizens. I mean, we've certainly heard how many times in the last year we're defending our democracy, we're the greatest democracy in the world, all those kinds of phrases. And yet, how odd it is to live in a democracy where half the folks don't even vote, and most of us don't feel it matters a huge amount, or oftentimes we don't. And we feel like we can't elect people who represent us enough to actually deal with the real problems of our time. It's an odd shape of democracy. I don't think it's what Jefferson intended. Certainly not what he dreamed and hoped of. And so part of the challenge, I think, is to ask the question, well, why is it that we don't act? And my own sense is we're not taught. I mean, think about our images of social activism, of people who take stands on larger public issues. Often it's the caricatures. 50,000 people gather in Seattle around the World Trade Center, all sorts of powerful questions that they're raising, and there's labor activists and environmental activists and human rights activists, and then the cameras show 50 people smashing the windows at a Starbucks, and they make it all look as if it's just a bunch of crazies. So we get a lot of negative images. But think about the positive ones even. I use the example of Rosa Parks. I mean, anybody, I can go into any 7th grade class. People will know the name of Rosa Parks. But do they know the story? I remember being interviewed on CNN, and Parks was going to be on by telephone, and I was all excited, and they started introducing her, and they said, "We're so proud to have Rosa Parks here. One day, she was riding on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and she refused to move to the back of the bus, and that started the civil rights movement." And I thought, well, not exactly. No, not exactly. Because it didn't start there for Rosa Parks, and it didn't start there for the civil rights movement. She'd been an activist for 12 years. She was the secretary of the local NAACP chapter. She didn't act alone. She acted as part of a community, a very conscious one. She didn't just stumble onto history. In fact, she'd taken training sessions at a wonderful labor and civil rights center called Highlander Center in Tennessee the summer before her arrest. And you think about at least I did, the difference in impact between the myth and the reality. The myth is this woman just kind of steps out of nowhere. I remember Garrison Keillor on Prairie Home Companion, Martin Luther King Day a couple of years ago, said, "Rosa Parks wasn't an activist. She was just a woman with her groceries who was tired." Well, no, again, I mean, well-meaning, but that's not the truth. She was somebody who intentionally acted. Doesn't mean that she knew how everything was going to turn out. I mean, you never do. But she was somebody who said, this is what needs changing, and I'm going to address it as best I can. She was somebody, she didn't act alone. She acted as part of a community. She was linked through the network of the NAACP and other allied groups all across the South and across the nation. Because you don't very often change things by yourself. You change things with small groups of people, sometimes 5 or 6 or 8 or 10, but it always takes more than one to be able to magnify the impact and keep each other going and do those difficult kinds of tasks that need doing when you're trying to change society. And it wasn't as if she just suddenly decided one day on the bus to change things and everything changed, because 12 years from that first day she got involved till that day in Montgomery we've heard of, 10 more years till the Civil Rights Act gets passed. There were, I think it's 500,000 black men in Florida who couldn't vote because of Jim Crow era laws that said if you've ever been arrested in a felony, and of course doesn't apply to the daughter of Jeb Bush when she got busted for Xanax. She managed to somehow skate. But it applies to somebody, who makes a mistake when they're 18 and 20 years later can't vote. We're dealing with these issues still, obviously. So you look at the history and you think, what do we teach? Do we teach what it means to be able to take a stand? Or do we just have a few people who look so impossibly heroic that we could never equal them? We could never match who they are. And I think the latter is often what happens. We just feel like, well, yeah, of course, there's King and Parks and the people on the pedestal, but who are we? We're nothing. I like when a friend of mine, this wonderful young African-American woman, does a lot of interracial coalitions in Atlanta, was saying she heard one of the teachers who taught Martin Luther King at Morehouse College. And he was talking about King as a young man and Sonia said, well, what really impressed me is he got a C in his philosophy class. And she said, if King got a C in his philosophy class, there's hope for all the rest of us. I'm not saying, go out and try and get a C in your philosophy class or anything else. I'm just saying history isn't made by perfect individuals. And the more we recognize that, the more that we can give ourselves permission to be able to join that stream of people who've struggled for change. But again, we're not taught it. I remember asking somebody, I think it was a student in West Virginia, I said, well, what do you learn about any of the great movements that have changed the society for the better? The civil rights movement, the populist movements, the union movements, the women's suffrage movement, the abolitionist movement, any of them. He said, well, to be honest, don't learn much. We learn the conclusions. We don't learn the process. We learned that Lincoln freed the slaves and women got the vote and some unions were organized and somebody led a big civil rights march in Washington, and I see a picture in my history textbook, and I have no idea how those people got themselves together to join and have 200,000 people in D.C. He said, I never know the process. I think that's true. I mean, just think back to your own upbringing. What did you learn in your social studies classes? What did you learn about how change occurs? What do you learn from the media? Not much, I don't think. So it's as if we're told build a house and all we have is a pile of rubble and a few tools in a mess, and we're never taught how to be a carpenter. I think that we have to be able to learn the skills, and they're not hard, but you learn them as you go. You learn them a step at a time. The image is that to be able to take a stand on anything from the possibility of war with Iraq to literacy programs here in our community to welfare politics to whatever, you have to know everything. Every single fact, every single figure, every 17th decimal point statistic. You have to be able to debate Kissinger on Nightline at a drop of a hat. Most of us don't feel up for that. I think that what happens is we get caught in this perfect standard, and it becomes, the image I use is a high jump bar. It's always higher than we can jump, no matter how much we know. It's always a little higher, a little higher, a little higher, a little higher. Never quite do we get to that level of confidence where we actually feel like we can take the stand we want to. And of course, in this time, sometimes we're told, and I'll talk about this later, but we're told that to question the administration is to be, quote, an ally of terrorism or, in some sense, disloyal. It's nonsense. But it's dangerous nonsense, and maybe we've convinced ourselves. To me, being a patriot is you ask the harder questions in the hardest possible time. You ask the difficult questions. Those are the real patriots. And yet again, we get intimidated. We feel like we can't do anything. And if I look at the process of the people who actually do make change, it's always step by step. It's always being uncertain. It's always hesitating every moment of the way. I think of a wonderful woman I write about in Soul of a Citizen, a woman named Virginia Ramirez, who started out, she had an 8th grade education. She dropped out of school to have her kids. It was just what they did back then in her community in San Antonio, Texas, in the barrio. Her husband drove a taxi. They barely got by. She wasn't very involved in the community, didn't really look out beyond her own door. And then one point, an old woman in her neighborhood died. Basically, her house was so run down that the wind would just whip through it every winter, and she would get sicker and sicker and finally died of pneumonia. And the paramedics who carried her away said this woman would be alive today if somebody had just fixed up her home. And Virginia was furious because she'd actually tried to get some help from the city, and from community groups, different places, they'd just been turned away. 2 poor women. No one was going to pay them much mind. And so she went to a meeting at her local Catholic church because there's a group called COPS, Communities Organized for Public Services, part of a network called the Industrial Areas Foundation, founded by the legendary organizer Saul Alinsky. And she went down there and said, what are you going to do about it? And they asked her what she was going to do, and she was confused and left. And there was a knock on her door about a week later, and a nun who worked with the group who volunteered asked her why she was so upset. And Virginia started telling the woman the story of her life and about the old woman dying and how no one cared about the kids in the neighborhood, and her father picked crops his whole life and got treated worse than a dog, and on and on and on. She said, just nobody cares about our community. The nun asked whether her neighbors cared. And Virginia thought, well, I suppose they do, but nobody's going to listen to them anymore. They're going to listen to her. And very hesitantly agreed to host a house meeting. And when she opened the door, she was so terrified. This is just for her neighbors. Talk to some of her neighbors about the problems in the community. Because that kind of discussion, that kind of people voicing what's often unvoiced is the first step to change. And she was so terrified she could barely even speak. And she said her knees were shaking, her stomach was clenched. But then they started talking, and they talked about their kids, and they had some food, and it actually turned out it was kind of nice. So she agreed to host another one and was kind of looking forward to it, and gradually got involved step by step by step in the organization. And then one day was at the San Antonio City Council testifying on some streets that had gotten, supposedly were going to be fixed in the poor neighborhoods, and as usual, the money went up to the northern, wealthier areas. And Virginia got up and then just froze. She said, I forgot my speech, I forgot my name, I forgot everything. She said, I just went totally blank. I was so terrified because these were city councilmen, and who was I? I was a woman with an 8th grade education. And then she realized that she was talking about something she knew, her community. She could do that, and she talked about it. And again, gradually more and more involved, and over a period of years, COPS brought about $2 billion of resources into the very poorest barrios of San Antonio and really began to transform the city. And one day Virginia found herself in Washington, D.C., testifying before Congress on a job, kind of a model job program they'd put together. And I asked her afterwards, I said, well, weren't you absolutely terrified? I mean, these are U.S. congressmen and senators. She said, well, yeah, I was a little bit nervous, prayed to God I wouldn't make a complete fool of myself. But she said, to be honest, I was a lot more scared talking to my neighbors the first time. I was just a lot more scared talking to the San Antonio City Council. She said, by the time I got to the U.S. Senate and Congress, she said, I knew I would do the best I could, and that was all I could do. She said, but I did learn something afterwards, sitting out there on the steps. She said two things. She said, I learned that these people who got me involved found something in me that I never knew I had, a strength. We often don't know our strength till we exercise it. She said, everything I know I learned at the University of Cops, which I thought was kind of an odd phrase because Cops isn't a campus. It doesn't have a basketball team or a baseball team. It's not Richmond or VCU or University of Texas or any of that. It's a community group. So why is she saying this? She's saying it because what she meant is that involvement is a place where you learn. You learn how to speak. You learn how to act. You learn how to take a stand. And I think it's important for all of us to remember that we just don't know. We may think, well, somebody asked in one of the classes earlier today, is there a certain kind of person destined to lead? Well, if you look at Virginia at age 25, she doesn't look like she's destined to lead. And yet, what a powerful leader she is now. So I think we don't really know until we test ourselves and push ourselves. I remember a student who worked on family farm issues, University of Nebraska, came in. She said she was just the shyest freshman imaginable, always stayed at the back of the class, kept her head down, never spoke out, never hoped she'd never be called on even. And then she got involved fighting for family farms like the one she grew up in and brought speakers in, and she and her friends got a new course in the curriculum to deal with these issues, and ended up being the Deputy Agriculture Commissioner of the entire state of Nebraska at age 25. That is the number 2 job in agriculture in an agricultural state. And Barb said, we're talking, she said, well, of course I'm confident now, but I wasn't back then. I was shy. It was taking those stands that led me to be able to act, that led me to be able to have this confidence. And so again, I think it's so important to understand that whatever the issues we take on, we don't start from that point of absolute confidence, certainty. We start often from points of doubt, from places where we just don't know what is going to happen. We're not sure. We're not sure of our gifts. We're not sure of our strengths. And we do the best we can. That's always how things turn out. Sometimes we don't even know the impact of our actions. I mean, at points you'll take a stand. I remember there was a retired Safeway truck driver that was involved in a hunger action group. And he described how he made some phone calls to some Congress people, sort of gave them, there's a wonderful group called Results, it's a grassroots citizen lobby, and they're trying to lobby through funds for tuberculosis prevention. And he talked to his congressman's aide and told him how another congressman was going to be voting and how he'd have to approach him to switch his vote, and kind of literally this retired Safeway truck driver navigating this congressional aide on how to play the lay of the land. And it worked. And a few weeks later, the bill passed, and I think it was $35 million. And this guy Melio said, well, I just realized I lobbied through $35 million. And this is not, again, I'm not talking about a professor or a doctor or anything. This is a retired Safeway truck driver in Denver. And I thought, yeah, that's amazing. This is the power we never know we have. Sometimes we don't even know the power we have when we're making a difference. I remember, and maybe this is a lesson that could be applied to the possible war in Iraq that I think would be a god-awful disaster. Back in Vietnam, there was one point where Nixon actually was threatening and very possibly preparing to use nuclear weapons. And he conveyed a threat to Henry Kissinger that either the North Vietnamese surrender or use them, and no telling that they could have necessarily surrendered for the Viet Cong. But be that as it may, the targeting plans were drawn up, and according to Daniel Ellsberg, we were ready to go. We were ready to bomb with a nuclear weapon the first time since Hiroshima. A horrible thing if that had happened. And during the same period, there was a huge march on Washington, during which Nixon watched the Washington Redskins football game and said, I don't care what these hippies think. This isn't affecting me. And there was something called a moratorium that was decentralized throughout the country, people vigiling, holding signs all in their local communities. And Nixon said that those two events together convinced him that he couldn't get away politically with using nuclear weapons. And so here was a case where people might have stopped the use of nuclear weapons and didn't even know it. And in fact became, at that very point, frustrated, brittle, self-destructive. All the cliches of the worst images from the 60s come out of that failure of hope that followed that. And so we don't always know what our actions are going to be. But we have to be able to act to be able to have any chance of seeing how they play out. I think we need a lot of times to think large. I mean, think of the corruption of money by politics. I mean, the last events of Enron and WorldCom and Tyco and Imclone and the whole Halliburton Cheney's company. I mean, the whole list of companies that have lied and melted down and just betrayed everyone who put trust in them. Well, what does that say about our society? I mean, think of right after September 11th, and we're talking about uniting together. And Kenneth Lay of Enron's way of uniting is to basically dump together with his fellow executives, I think it was a couple $1 billion worth of stock. It was a gigantic amount. Tell the employees that they were not allowed to sell their stock. Encourage the employees to buy more, however. I mean, what kind of level of betrayal and greed is that? I find it hard to imagine as a human being. But it's pretty consistent with Enron's history. I mean, there's a plant in India that the Indian government had to end up, they basically bribed its way through a power plant, and the Indian government, terms were so bad, the Indian government of that province had to pay them not to run it because the deal was so bad and so outrageous. I mean, it's how I live on the West Coast, and our energy rates were just immensely last year manipulated. California, huge debts by their jerking up the prices and taking plants offline and tripling or quadrupling, or in some cases, 100 times higher price of electricity. It's very ugly history. And then I look and I think, this is disturbing that this is a company that was the largest historical donor to George Bush. It was, along with their lawyers, Klins and Vincent and Arthur Anderson, accounting firm to the corrupt companies, there were 3 of his 10 largest donors last round. Half the cabinet has ties to Enron. The head of the Republican National Committee was getting $1 million a year from them until recently. This is very disturbing. And I think, well, what do we do about that? Because it's not just, we could say, I think this is the attitude much of the media. It's like you have a dog that's done something bad and you swat it with a newspaper and you say, bad dog, bad Enron, don't do that again. I don't think that's adequate. What we're really talking about is the hijacking of our democracy on some level by these huge greed-driven entities. And yet, there are alternatives. In Soul of a Citizen, one of the models I write about is this amazing campaign finance reform that passed in Maine, Arizona, Massachusetts, and Vermont, where if you get enough $5 contributions now, you basically get public matching funds to run for office. And the people who pushed it through, they had no guarantee it was going to win. I remember the person I spoke to, she just said, well, look, I just think that my kids deserve something better than living in this cynical world. I want to pass on something to them. And then lo and behold, it passed and it got a majority of Republicans, a majority of Democrats, a majority of independents. People across, with very, very different political belief systems recognized that there was something of value in returning democracy to ordinary people. And I got a couple of letters passed on to me by people who were running during the last election round. One was a Democrat, one was a Republican. Democrat said, went to the PTA meetings. I said, this is what I believe in. I want the $5 contributions. I hope you'll support me. He said, I got enough to run, never had to talk to a $1,000 donor. The Republican said basically the same thing. He said, before I would always have to be listening to the people who gave me the money. Now I just have to listen to my constituents and my conscience. Doesn't mean that the two agreed on everything. They didn't. They disagreed on a lot. But it does mean that they both recognize the value of returning politics to ordinary citizens. There's now a group called Democracy Matters, has a website of that name, .org, that's focusing on campuses to push. Imagine if a state like Virginia, with its legacy of history, could actually push something through like that, what an impact it would have on our country. Part of the challenge, I think, is we don't always know the hopeful examples. We're not told the Virginia Ramirez's stories, or we're not told the story of the clean elections reform. The media, somehow, we'll focus sometimes on individual acts of kindness and generosity, and certainly those are worthwhile, but we won't ask those larger questions. I think of that sometimes in the volunteering that a lot of us do. I mean, there's much, much good work done by people involved in Habitat and Big Brothers and Big Sisters and literacy programs and food banks and shelters and all of that. It's wonderful, important work. But I also think maybe we need to push it and ask some larger, harder questions. I remember there was a Stanford student who said, very well-meaningly, said, I just hope that my grandchildren get to volunteer in the same homeless shelter that I have. And his friend said, very gently, his friend said, that's not why we're doing it. Because that's not why they were doing it. They really did want to be able to change things. And to change things, you have to ask those larger questions. I mean, it is fine to start by going out there one-on-one, but after a while, think about what you've learned from that experience, working with that big brother, big sister, working tutoring, whatever it happens to be at the senior center. And come back to your classes and ask, what do I want to know about the situation that created this problem I'm trying to address? Are there common choices that we could make that would make things better for this kid or for this senior or for whatever it happens to be? There's people in abused children's home, whatever it is. Are there larger choices? Doesn't mean we're necessarily going to agree on all those choices. I mean, that's a democracy. It involves disagreement. But it does mean that we have to take those larger, harder steps at some point to raise them. And again, I'm not in any way dismissing the value of that one work, but I also think that we have to say, where do our resources go as a country? What are our priorities? What does it mean that we gave $1.3 trillion to the wealthiest 1 in 100 people in this country? And what does that say about our willingness to address the desperate needs here in our own communities, let alone halfway across the globe? Now, I've mentioned September 11th at the beginning, and I want to think a little bit more about that together. One of the things that disturbed me is that how to describe it? When those terrible events happened, I think there was a moment, as I've suggested, of serious connection, of serious recognition of our common human bond that made us better people for a little while at least. And I think that's gotten buried in the period since. And I think part of what's buried it is a notion, well, I call it the war of good versus evil. I mean, Bush used the phrase. It's the war of good versus evil. And I understand the idea that these were reprehensibly evil actions. I mean, to murder 3,000 innocent people, I mean, how can you call them anything else? But I get a little bit queasy when I talk about the U.S. as the forces of good arrayed against the forces of evil. I mean, think about the history. Think about bin Laden and how we helped get him his political start when we went in and created the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviet Union. According to Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, we actually went in 6 months before the Russians invaded because we wanted to draw them into a trap, kind of like Vietnam. And there was an article, an interview with him 6 months before September 11th happened, and he was very proud. He said it worked. But part of what it also did is it killed about 1 million people in that country, and it embittered God knows how many more. And we created that force in which bin Laden first became involved politically. Before that, he was a wealthy playboy and apolitical. I think about the Gulf War that we're talking about fighting again, and I go back to some of the history that probably most of you don't even know. 1950, I guess it was 53, we overthrew a democratically elected government in Iran. They had the audacity to try and nationalize some of their own oil. We didn't like that, and we overthrew a guy named Mossadegh, installed the Shah of Iran. He was just a brutal dictator, as brutal as anybody around. And we supported him militarily, and we trained his secret police, armed them. I mean, he was our shadow figure out there in that part of the world. And finally, he destroyed so much of the opposition that the only forces that could overthrow him were the Islamic fundamentalist groups around the Ayatollah Khomeini, and finally did. And of course, that wasn't a whole lot prettier either. And partly because of that, we started backing Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist Party in Iraq, helped bring them to power. They fought a 10-year war against Iran. About 1 million people died. We used, after he'd gassed his own people like defense, well, he wasn't defense secretary, Rumsfeld, he was an official in the Bush administration, helped give Saddam Hussein satellite pictures so they could attack Iran more effectively. I mean, they basically, he was just as evil then as he is now. And I look at all those chains of history, and we could talk about others. There was a democracy in Chile that died September 11th as well, in a coup that we sponsored. I look at that and I think, maybe we'd better be a little bit more humble. Maybe we'd better be a little bit more careful about saying this is the war of good versus evil. Maybe we'd better, if we really, if the question, to me the question is, not how do we get vengeance, but how do we stop these kinds of actions from occurring again so more innocent people don't die? That seems to be the real question. And if we recognize that oftentimes we've gone in recklessly for not very good motives and made things worse, we'd better be a little careful. We'd better be a little bit questioning. And it really angers me when I see an administration that feels like they get orders from God saying they have a right to do whatever they want, doesn't matter what the world says. There was a treaty on terrorism they pulled out of before September 11th happened, and a treaty on global warming, and a treaty on landmines, and an international criminal court treaty, and a treaty on selling small weapons, rifles and pistols internationally that they pulled out of and undermined. The list was huge. And you're thinking, here's this event that tied the world together in sympathy for the U.S. And at every point we're saying, well, we don't have to listen to that. We don't have to listen to those people. Any more than the administration felt they had to listen domestically when they cut funding for child abuse and low-income housing and low-income energy assistance and every possible program that affected the poorest and neediest here at home. I'm saying that because I'm disturbed by those actions, and that I think that they cast some doubt on the people who are unfortunately running the show at this point. And it goes beyond whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. In fact, I would argue that probably most of the real questions raised so far about the Iraq invasion have been raised by some honorable Republicans, for which I applaud them. But in looking at those actions, we have to say this seems to be an administration that is significantly disconnected from the ties that link them to other human beings. And some of its history, here Dick Cheney was somebody who, he voted against funds for Head Start, and he voted against the resolution supporting the freeing of Mandela from jail in South Africa. And you look at the history, it's not very pretty. John Ashcroft made his career intimidating black voters in St. Louis. It's some ugly history. Not saying the guys before didn't have some severe problems, they did. But I'm just saying right now, we ought to be questioning. We shouldn't take on blind faith that whatever the president says, and this would be true whoever he or she was, is automatically right. Again, to me, being a patriot means questioning, asking the hard questions in the most difficult time. And I look at the things that we could do. What are the things that inflamed the Islamic world against us? There were sanctions in Iraq where 500,000 children have died because we destroyed their sanitation and health infrastructure. They know that in the Islamic world. We don't. That's a problem. They look at our support of the corrupt dictatorships in the Gulf, the oil politics that drives it, and they see us as hypocrites. That's a problem. They look at the endless war in the Middle East with Israel. I'm Jewish. I have relatives, cousins in Tel Aviv. I don't certainly want to see them blown up by a suicide bomb. I also have to recognize that everything Sharon has done, bulldozing houses, evicting people, putting for 10 years developing settlements throughout the occupied territories, all of this makes it more likely, not less likely, that more innocent people will die in Israel and in Palestine both. And we've given a blank check to Sharon's most reckless actions, with a few cautions by Colin Powell, who then promptly gets outvoted. So I look at all that and I see some difficult issues that we're going to have to address. I look at the talk of war with Iraq, and I guess the headlines the other day, Mandela, who's not a naive person. Nelson Mandela has seen much about human evil in his time, said, do not go in there and attack. It will make things worse. And Kofi Annan from the UN, and how many people can we get to sign on of other nations? Maybe Tony Blair at this point, maybe a few others if we twist their arms. I had many difficulties with Bush's father. But nonetheless, at least he got an international consensus before he went into Iraq. We seem to be resolved that it doesn't matter what other nations think. And yet if we go in there, all that does is fulfill every stereotype of the U.S. as bully. It doesn't make the world safer. I don't know if you folks have heard any of the writings or read the people named, a guy named Scott Ritter was the main inspector on disarmament for the weapons on the ground in Iraq. And he helped dismantle some of the possible biological and chemical warfare sites. And he said if he thought it was a serious threat, he would advocate going in today, but it is not a serious threat because we have destroyed those sites. A guy named Hans von Spanak, who was the head of, he resigned in protest, he was the head humanitarian relief for the UN in Iraq. And he's talked about, he spoke in Seattle, there was a couple sites that some of our politicians have singled out as being linked to chemical or biological warfare weapons. He demanded to get taken to those sites. They were ruined hulks of factories. Nothing, civilian or military, could be produced in them anymore. He saw it with his eyes. Somehow we don't cover that. And again, this is, these are hard questions. They're not easy, but it seems to me that at least some of us are going to have to raise our voices and ask for a serious debate about this. I mean, John Warner, to his credit, is one of the Republicans, your senator here, who has raised some issues, who has raised some questions. I mean, what would happen if thousands of people, or people from every campus in the state said, look, we agree with you. Thanks for raising these questions. Keep on raising them. We don't want to go in cavalierly treating this as, we're going on a picnic to the beach when we're going to go in and invade this country. Our brave young men and women in the service are going to be put at risk. Thousands of, if not tens of thousands, of innocent civilians will die. It's a serious action. And I think we have to at least begin to tackle these hard questions. Again, there's a question, what does it mean to be a patriot? Is the patriot blind loyalty? I don't think so. I like the image of, years ago there was a woman I profiled, she was the National Mother of the Year. She was a 79-year-old grandmother who basically went out with some other people and blockaded a Trident submarine off the Washington State coast, risking 10 years in jail because she just saw the nuclear arms race as madness. And at one point the Coast Guard was using water cannons to kind of tip these small boats into the water so they couldn't reach the submarine and blockade it. And this young Coast Guardsman aimed this water cannon at this 79-year-old grandmother, and she turned and she shook her finger at him. And she said, young man, in that grandmotherly voice that all of us probably have heard, young man, not in my America, please, you wouldn't. I like that notion because she's aiming, she's saying, yes, I'm a patriot. It's my America. But I'm going to demand that this America be what it ought to be. And if it isn't, I'm going to work to make it so. Now, that work can start out for us with something small. That's fine. It can be a first step. That's okay. But I think it's important to see in terms of a long haul. And there's a person who I really admired, a woman who died at 101 years old. I write about her in Soul of a Citizen, named Hazel Wolf, who really taught me lessons about how you keep on. She got her start. She was in her 20s. She was a union activist, organized unions all around Washington State. And one of the things I didn't know till I met her is the unions of that time in Washington had actually passed one of the first model public retirement systems that became a national model along with some other states for Social Security. And what was interesting is that something that she did in her 20s benefited Hazel and millions of other people because she worked as a secretary and never made a whole lot of money. And so when she retired, she was living off Social Security, and she'd helped bring it into being, 70 years later as a 20-year-old, 20-something-year-old. And then she got involved in all sorts of different issues. And in her early 60s, she got involved in environmental issues, mostly with the Audubon Society, because she really loved watching birds. And she built in what they call environmental justice coalitions, where you would ask why the toxic waste dumps are always in the poorest communities and the minority communities and on. And she'd bring in the Native American tribes, and she'd bring in union activists and things that people weren't. Now they're doing it, but 30 years ago these were coalitions that were unthinkable, and Hazel was always ahead of her time. And she continued till literally, the year before she died, she was still. I'd go to her little apartment, and she'd be talking on the phone, and she'd say, my fax just rang. I'm organizing a conference, and typing on a computer somebody had donated to her for a newsletter. I'm thinking, my God, this woman has seen a lot of change in her lifetime. From the world where they barely had automobiles to computers and faxes and cell phones and whatnot. And I'd ask her how she continued on, because I mean, she had so much energy in her, even at age 100. And she gave me a couple lessons. She said, well, I've learned that you can't do everything. Good lesson. She said, but you can do what you can, and then you can do some more, and you can do that your entire life. So knowing how to pace ourselves, that sometimes maybe we do have to say no. But we also can taking on large and important issues and keep on doing that. It helps to have a sense of humor. I remember about 10 years ago, she was down in Central America during or it was maybe a dozen years, the kind of Bush Senior Central America Wars, and a congressman came up to her and very condescendingly said to her, oh, I hear you're a bird watcher, kind of like, you're not the tone you use when somebody's not very bright. And she said, oh, yes, there's lots of birds in Washington, D.C. that need watching these days. He just didn't say anything after that. So she wasn't over-intimidated, didn't take herself too seriously either. She said, well, you need to go out and refresh your soul. You go out and you hike in the mountains or kayak on a river, both of which she did in her 90s. Then she gets a mischievous smile. She says, then you come back ready to take on Exxon. And I remember, you got to imagine her 100th birthday party. 600 people packing a hall. There is not space for a single other person. Several hundred try and come in. It's just full. And everybody is there because they've been touched by Hazel Wolf. And they're talking about it, and they're telling the stories. And somebody said, yeah, I was in 7th grade, and she spoke to my 7th grade class. I've been an environmental activist ever since. Somebody else said, yeah, I retired at age 65, and she called me up the next week and said, hey, youngster, you're just getting started. I got a committee for you to be on. The guy was the head of all the Native American tribes in the country, of their national federation, described being the first person in his entire tribe to go to college. And how he's in a little basement apartment, totally broke, totally overwhelmed, totally isolated. Weren't a lot of support systems back then. Some pretty overt bigotry that he faced. And it was Hazel who kept knocking on his door and saying, you've got to continue. You're not just doing this for yourself, you're doing this for your community. She said, I wouldn't be where I am without Hazel. And I just started thinking about, what makes a life worth living. Hazel didn't have a lot of money. She's not going to be able to she didn't write on her gravestone, I had a huge TV set, I drove a car the size of a house. Those are the goals that I think too often our society pushes. I mean, here we say, September 11th changes us. But what we have to do to be patriotic, I remember I sent a letter in my local paper where somebody said, be patriotic, go out and buy a sofa. Well, I don't know. I think there's other goals, higher goals than going out and buying a sofa. I really do. And Hazel embodied them. Virginia Ramirez embodied them. Hazel Wolf embodied them. All those folks who act for change embody them. And I think it's just a richer way to live. And if I want to take the lesson of that horrible day a year ago, why do people still become firefighters knowing that this might happen? They do it because they have some sense of, maybe there's an adrenaline rush for danger, but I think it's fundamentally some sense of a connection with their fellow human beings. Some value they place on doing something for their fellow human beings. And I think we have to take that ethic, take that value of those lives, again, that were lost, and say, how do we create a world of justice? How do we create a world where nobody is expendable, where nobody is casually annihilated? And maybe that's a task for our grandchildren, but we got to begin it now. And I think as we do, we learn something tremendously profound. We learn why we're here on this earth to begin with, what makes us human beings. And that's the most powerful lesson we can learn. Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to take questions, and because this is being recorded for the radio, there's mics there, and so raise your hand and I'll point to you, and the mic people will come, and that way the radio people will hear the question as well as the answer. Okay, over there. So somebody give them a mic. So you can be cooperative, you can pass the mic. That's, teamwork and working together. Yes?
I was curious to what degree you thought that America should be more of a social welfare state than it is, similar to how some European nations provide more social welfare for their citizens. I know in your book you talk about the effects of Social Security and other welfare programs on our society as a whole. I was wondering what you thought about the idea of making some of those programs more privatized, and how that would possibly affect.
Yeah, I think privatizing would be a terrible idea. I mean, you look at something like Social Security, that, I mean, millions and millions of people, that is what they live on. And the idea that, you're going to do what? Turn it over to stockbrokers who are going to take a percentage out and invest it in Enron, WorldCom. And, I mean, that's a bad idea. I mean, bad enough that if it happens to us individually. But to take that sort of foundation that everybody, if they hit a certain age, is going to have something, and to speculate, to put it on the craps table, it's a terrible idea. I mean, one of the interesting things is how much there's been a hype about the crisis of solvency in Social Security. In fact, there's enough funds for 40 to 50 years. At a certain point, they need to make an adjustment. One thing they could do is just, right now there's a cap on income. So you pay Social Security taxes up to about $85,000. From there on, you don't. Bill Gates pays the same amount in Social Security taxes as somebody who makes $85,000. You drop that, you take that cap away, there's a huge amount of money that then goes in that can balance the books. I mean, that's not the only solution, but it certainly is one that makes sense to me. So I think what happens is that there's a notion, and I really do think that the lessons of those corrupt companies are just very illustrative. It's not to say that there's no place for the market, but the idea that the market solves all problems, well, it doesn't. It has very strong institutional forces towards greed, and unless you figure out a way to check them, you're going to have a mess. You look at healthcare. I mean, think about what it is. I mean, we are the only advanced industrialized country in the world that doesn't give healthcare to everybody. England, Ireland, Japan, Italy, Spain, Canada, France, on and on and on. Lots of countries that are poorer than us. Why don't we do this? I mean, some countries did it 50 years ago. We got 47 million people who don't have health insurance, and lots of them die as a result. They may get treated at the emergency room if they go there, but if they have the high blood pressure that's about to give them the heart attack, they get turned away. Why don't we do that? I mean, would anybody in Congress consent to say, okay, why don't you go without health insurance and have your family go without health insurance for the next 5, say a senator, for your 6-year term, just to see how it felt like? I mean, could you imagine how outraged they'd be? They'd be appalled. How dare you? Why is it okay for them and not for the rest of us? So it just seems to me that certain basic things ought to be guaranteed human beings. And, at least in a society that's affluent as ours, just because we're humans. And people ought to be able to have the right to eat, to have a roof over their head, to have, medical care when they're sick. I don't think we should guarantee everybody an SUV. I don't think I got problems with SUVs in general. But, but those basics of survival, yeah. And the idea that you're going to play dice with them, that just seems so reckless and so callous. Brett, yeah.
Okay, well, about Enron and WorldCom, do you think there are more corrupt companies out there, and are we going to find out about their bad business practices?
Yeah, I think there are. Yes. I mean, and the tricky question is, it's not just the overt corruption, lying to, et cetera, et cetera. It's what does it mean to have companies that basically act destructively towards human lives? I mean, you look at something like Nike. I mean, Michael Jordan gets paid more to endorse Nike shoes than all the women in Indonesia who make the Nike shoes get paid to make them. There's something wrong with that. Is Nike cooking their books? Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe their books are perfectly straightforward. But there's still something wrong, I think, with that ethic where, yeah, they could afford to pay a living wage. Why don't they? Why do they support, encourage us to support governments that when somebody speaks out to try and organize a union in Indonesia or Malaysia, they throw them in jail or shoot them? I mean, why can't we at least create incentives for companies to act ethically. I mean, in Germany, if a company is over a certain size, the workers get a certain number of seats on the board. They have a say in it. That seems reasonable to me. I mean, you don't want that with your mom and pa diner, but if you've got a company that employs 5,000, 10,000 people, why shouldn't the people who work there be stakeholders? I mean, I saw a cooperative in Spain, it's a net federation of cooperatives called Mondragon, that has 50,000 people involved, producing things like high-tech robotic machines for manufacturing. And they run banks and farms and cooperative stores, and it's amazing. I really, I'm saying the market has no place, but I also think we have to raise some serious questions that look beyond it, and at least ask what kind of other mechanisms could we put in place so that economics isn't totally driven by greed.
I heard you challenging us to think about how to create a world of justice, and I was sort of wanted to turn around and ask you what you think about how to address the major foreign policy concerns today, and if you had Bush's ear for a moment, what would you tell him about what to do about terrorism and these other questions?
Well, I mean, if I were, or say I didn't have, by some chance I got to decide the policies, what would I do? I mean, not easy question for anybody. But I mean, the first thing I would do is to say, these are absolutely global issues. You got to deal with them globally. I mean, 60 countries lost people in those attacks. And so what does that mean? It means you get an international consensus. It means that, it is, and there's a debate from the beginning that got buried. Is this an act of war or is it a criminal act? I think it's a criminal act. Act of war is when one country invades another. A criminal act is when a bunch of people, an individual group of people, do something that's wrong and horrible to another group of people. And if it's a criminal act, well, if there's an Al-Qaeda group in Germany, I want them monitored. If they do something wrong and they start preparing a bomb, I want them arrested. I mean, I think that that's legitimate. I don't think you just sit by and do nothing. But first and foremost, you act with other countries in an international consensus. I mean, why is it that the states bordering Iraq, who basically were backing us during the first Gulf War, are absolutely, adamantly, and let's recognize that there's a cost to them to standing up. There's arm twisting, there's economic aid, there's threats of cuts of aid. I mean, they're pulling at every lever they can, and they're still saying, no, this is going to make things worse. You are going to have total chaos. We are going to be overthrown. You don't like things now. Wait and see what happens if you invade Iraq. You heed that. You take it seriously. I mean, in a case like Iraq, you want inspectors back in there, and you want close monitoring, and you want to make sure that Scott Ritter, the UN inspector, he said they don't have a nuclear weapon because there's devices that can sniff out the radiation and can tell whether or not nuclear materials are being transported. We've got that technology. Do you want to stop them from having that access? Absolutely. No problem with that. Stop them from, weapons of mass destruction? Absolutely. But part of the problem, I mean, again, it's easy to say, well, we go into Iraq because he's a bad guy. He's a bad guy. I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with that. But then what is the precedent that it sets if you say you go and you overthrow on your own anybody you don't like? Again, in Chile, it was a democracy we overthrew. In, was it Colombia, where was it Chavez is? About, 6 months ago, 9 months ago, there was an attempted coup. And they jumped in and they supported the coup to overthrow an elected government, and then basically people rallied in the streets and reversed it. That's ugly. And I'm not saying that person in power there is perfect or a saint or anything. Not Colombia, Venezuela. Is perfect or a saint. But the U.S. has a bad enough track record of going in and overthrowing democracies that you don't want to just open the door and say, whatever we want to do, it's fine because we're the U.S., because we're God's favored nation. And I think that if you require I'm not an absolute pacifist. I think there's times that you do need to use military force. But the threshold's got to be high. It can't be something you do cavalierly. If indeed you really have an international consensus that said, okay, look, there is no alternative, then I can sign on board on that. But I can't sign on board on the idea that we can just simply act on our own because somehow we know best. It sets us on way too dangerous a path. Let's see, there and then there.
You were saying that 9/11 brought about this connection between humans, and now a year later it's buried, and many people even disconnected themselves from people of other nationalities. What do you think contributes to the apathy towards the human connection, and how do you think we as Americans, will ever strive for that again?
Right, hard question. I hope we will. I think that there was a moment, I remember flying like the first couple weeks, like everyone was helping each other, literally, somebody go, oh, can I help put this thing up in the luggage rack? And some people volunteered to drive. I was at a Dayton Baptist College in Birmingham, Alabama, and some people volunteered to drive me 850 miles to make a date in Dallas the next day because the planes weren't flying. And I just saw all sorts of stuff like that happening. And I think that if indeed our national leadership, and who do I mean? I mean Bush and those folks, but I mean the media as well. I mean everybody else who sort of has the podium, had really started a dialogue about, the larger roots, about those connections. I think we would be in a very interesting, you can't say, it wouldn't have erased the deaths, but it would have been a much better place to deal with reality now. I think instead that the insistence that, again, well, how do you combat terrorism? Go shopping, go to the mall. That doesn't do it. I think that, we're the side of good versus evil, the stoking of the self-righteousness. And I understand the feeling of wanting to come together and, do something to affirm our connection, but just beating our chest and saying, Bin Laden, we're going to kick your ass, it doesn't get us to reflect. And so, I don't think the moment is completely lost because all of us have our own memories. And I think that there are conversations that can be, they can begin in this hall, on this campus, in our communities. But I do think that it's I'll use the word a tragedy, that our leadership didn't take that, difficult opportunity. Somebody said, well, what would they do if the first thing they were in office in September 11th hit, they'd resign and, get out of there. Not an easy situation for anybody. But I think that, what about the energy policy? We could have said, all right, how much has oil deformed our choices and what does it mean that we're totally reliant on? And could we actually, for a bunch of other good reasons like global warming, could we actually put our resources into alternative energy? Wind power is the fastest growing energy sector in the world today. And we didn't. Instead, Cheney had a meeting with only energy extractive industry lobbyists. The environmental groups weren't even at the table. That was the energy policy. That made us less secure. So I look at those choices, and I don't want to sound unhopeful. I think that there's still choices that we could bring into being, but it really is going to depend on us to do that. I don't think that we can trust that our leaders will, much as I would like that to be so.
You spoke about the value of building community for the change that can result, but where does the role of ethics play into that positive change? Because I wonder if Al-Qaeda was itself a community that initiated change.
Well, I think that's a good question. There's a couple ways it plays in. Certainly they were acting to make change, definitely so. And they were a community of people who shared their values. A couple issues arise. I would say the issue of means and ends is very real. No matter how righteous your cause, it is not acceptable to murder innocent people in the state for your cause. It just isn't. And that's what they did. So I can say, I can look at the issues that bin Laden raised, and some of them are real issues. They really are. The sanctions, the murderous total of the sanctions, the corrupt Gulf dictatorships, the need for justice in Palestine, in the Middle East. Those are real issues. But is it acceptable to murder innocent people? It really isn't. And so I think that, whatever actions we do, we have to take that in mind. And I think that becomes a check. You don't want to catch innocent people in the crossfire. One of the reasons that I was really angry at the people who trashed the windows at Nike Town and Starbucks during the WTO protest is not that, they weren't killing people. They weren't directly harming human people. But what happened is it made the cops really pissed off. And the cops got angry, and the cops decided they're going to have payback, and they started smashing heads of the nearest people were the people sitting nonviolently in line in front of them. And so was there a link between what happened to those people getting beat up? Yeah, there was. And cops shouldn't have done it, but nonetheless, it made it easier and more likely for them to do it. I don't think they would have if those people hadn't smashed the windows to begin with. So even when we're doing something that doesn't, directly harm human life, I just think we have to be cognizant about the relation between means and ends. The other thing I think is, because we're also asking, can one act in a wrong cause? That's also, implicit. And, certainly some of the aspects of what Al-Qaeda is supporting, I don't want to have a fundamentalist, I'm scared of Ashcroft, too, in that respect. Seriously. He'd be right. I really do. I don't know, I can't remember one of the TV comedians said, the terrorists can't take away our sacred freedoms. Only John Ashcroft can do that. He scares me. He thinks he has a direct line to God. God's much more complicated than that. God doesn't open up direct lines. And so how do you prevent your ability to proceed down a wrong track? I think you do it by listening, besides the means and ends question. By listening to other people. You listen to people who don't agree with you and powerful things happen. Sometimes you find a meeting place, sometimes you change, sometimes, they change you. It's a good exercise, whatever the issues we're involved in, to have that happen. And I think it's a corrective against that kind of insularity that, I've only read the stories in the newspapers the same as you have about, the people they're trying to piece together their lives of those terrorists, but it involved at a certain point an insularity, and a dangerous one, besides that kind of cavalier willingness to sacrifice other people's lives. But I think that's the corrective. In the back, there's somebody way in the back.
You mentioned a little bit about alternative energy sources. I was wondering, in your opinion, if the greed that's kind of associated with the oil industry, is that kind of preventing any potential waste from occurring?
I think
If we have a viable source of energy, would the U.S. willingly pull out of the Middle East and get some of this terrorism and madness just go away? So ought that to be our first priority?
Yeah, could we deal with those countries as if they're ordinary nations? If the oil wasn't an issue, I think it would radically change our relationship with it, our whole historical relationship. And I look at some of what I mentioned wind power. There's some astounding. I can't remember. Basically, I think Texas and North Dakota can survive with enough wind power could supply all the electricity of the entire U.S. It's astounding the curve of productivity. We haven't invested in any of that at all. That in 25 since the Carter administration, and even that wasn't that much. Imagine if we'd been pushing that the way we put money into, coal, oil, nuclear, every other energy aspect around. To me, it's just common sense. And why don't we do it? Well, it's the voices that speak more powerfully with the dollars. I think most Americans recognize that there ought to be an alternative. Again, it's the link between the campaign financing and the need to actually restore democracy. It seems to me that you're talking about basing forget the global warming, forget the Middle East. Oil is a finite resource. At some point, it runs out. Either we use it as a transitional bridge to resources that aren't finite, or when it runs out, my God, there's going to be hell to pay. And I don't think, it really is disturbing to me that I don't think that that current administration just has a clue on that. They seem so blinkered in their small world. To deny global warming when every scientific academy in the world has a consensus on it, it's very scary. And I think it's going to have to be citizens just saying, look, this is just outrageous. Again, we may not agree on everything, but we have to at least start raising some of these hard questions about a direction, because it's going to affect all of us. How about should we go one more question? One more. Oh, I see two hands up. Oh, I see. Well, how about two hands up, the people sitting at the aisle? Is Is that bad? Well, one's a student. How about 3 brief questions? All right. That's
So I have a question getting back to more your points on community activism.
yeah.
Both my parents were activists, still are. And I've, through the years, I've got higher education degrees, and I'm now working and all that. And I find myself not quite following in their footsteps, being as active as they were. However, what I've been seeing is that, we all, and many people in society, work longer and longer hours.
Yeah.
40-hour work week for many people is history. It's 50-hour work week. I work sometimes 60-hour weeks.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the tension between the push for productivity
it's
and
huge.
working more hours
and
the little bit of time that it leaves people to actually get together.
Somebody,
and
was
be
asking
active.
about Europe earlier. I think a friend of mine, it's a large coalition that's putting together a Take Back Your Time Day. And it's on, I think it's in November. No, it's in October. Basically, it's the difference between the number of hours that we work and the number of hours that Europeans work. And we work almost 2 months more a year. It's astounding. You go to Europe and, these are productive economies. They're not starving. And people have time to hang out with their families, to be involved in politics, to go to the beach. My God, what a novel concept. Here, nothing. And we sort of take it as a badge of pride that we beat ourselves up. And on the one hand, it's hard because we don't have the time for activism. But we got to remember the central demand of the labor movement for 200 years was around the length of the working week. And it was a 70-hour week, and it got chipped to 60 to 50 to 40. And then right around World War II, it got stuck. They added a few vocations. And then in the 70s, it started creeping back up. I think it's a very important issue. And, again, it's an issue that crosses political lines potentially. What could be more family values, quote unquote, than saying we want some time with our families? They do have that in Europe. We don't here. It's part of how we allow ourselves to be browbeaten, I think. Over there, and then that last one over there.
I liked your example of the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953. There's a lot that we forget, actually, and some do not even get covered. And I think media is partially to blame for this. So it's a question I have about the media, actually. What do you think is the reason, if you have one, the media covers only certain things? Why don't we see what the rest of the world sees?
It disturbs me. There's a wonderful alternative media site, by the way, called commondreams.org. In fact, there's a link off my website to a lot of media sites. My website is soulofacitizen.org, just like the book. And I have a lot of media links on it. And one of the things that happens when I log on to Common Dreams is I'll read articles from all around the country, but also from around the English language global press. And I'll be astounded at the wide spectrum of debate in England or India compared to here. Or in the Middle East, the widened spectrum of debate in Israel. If you read something like Haaretz. And I think what happens is that we've got this, amazing concentration of ownership. It is so destructive. And basically, this just small group of people deciding, we don't think this is important. At the same time, even the alternatives, I'm delighted that the public radio station here is broadcasting this. Nationally, I've seen more and more timidity as it becomes more and more dependent on corporate dollars. And that's something that people need to challenge. We need to say, look at something like the BBC, which through, conservative liberal administrations, in England, it's stayed this beacon of, very, very good and serious reporting. And it just seems to me that part of the challenge is, one, all of us need to tap into alternative media sources so we get some different perspective, and also really fight to hold the ones that we do have accountable and to say, you got to cover this stuff. This is part of the world we live in. And I know a lot of examples. We had some projects in Seattle where people really, in the Central America Wars, really worked on giving just good, concise, clear information to the local TV stations, radio stations, and newspapers, and the coverage did get better. I think there are things, particularly locally, that people can do, but it is hard, and it's disturbing that, particularly if you just stay at home watching TV, I don't think you get much sense of the world. And in fact, there have been studies that's really actually, it was one during the Gulf War, that the most critical aspects of all the issues leading up to it, the more you watch TV, the less you knew about them. Not very reassuring. But still, that's the challenge to us, to try and draw people out from behind the tube to get and really listen to some alternatives. Final question. Yeah.
I heard you speculate briefly on Thomas Jefferson in your lecture, and I was wondering if I could take it back a couple of centuries and ask your opinion on to what extent you think the framers might view the current administration's attacks on bin Laden and al-Qaeda in Iraq as defending the country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I mean, obviously they couldn't conceive of, the weapons of mass destruction
Right.
that we have now. So
Well,
to what extent do you think they...
I mean, I think that there's different strains in American history that were reflected. They were reflected at that Constitutional Convention. I mean, and God knows they had their blind spots on, issues like slavery and a lot of other issues. I think that, they passed at one point the Alien and Sedition Acts that basically forbade you to criticize the president. Those were bad news. I mean, that was a terrible piece of legislation. And to me, I guess if I'm looking back, and, I guess in some sense it's easy to quote Jefferson, whoever, he's not around to argue with you, so he can log in on whatever size you choose. But it seems to me that that Bill of Rights is a pretty amazing document. I actually have more mixed feelings about the Constitution. I think it was a good document for its time, but, it's something like the Electoral College that allows Bush to lose by 500,000 votes and be installed in office. I don't think that's I don't think anybody could argue that that's real democracy. But those Bill of Rights, it's pretty good, pretty amazing even for this time. And I look at them, and I see them being eroded, and it's not to describe it. I was talking to somebody earlier. It doesn't work to say the Bill of Rights is being eroded. It sounds abstract. What it means to say, what works, I think, is to say they really took seriously the notion that it was important, or at least the people who passed it through, to be able to assemble in public and voice what you believe without being shot down. That's an important right. It's what separates a democracy from a dictatorship. And so they put that in there. It's important to say you have the right to speak, and a government's not going to be able to say, we don't like what you say, so we're going to throw you in jail. It's important to say we don't want the government being able to swoop down on your house on any pretense and search through everything you have and come up with something that's going to incriminate you. You need some kind of standard of evidence. I think those kinds of rights were amazingly, to put them down at that point, amazingly ahead of their time. And many of them have been fought for and expanded because they weren't really realized for much of our 200 years. They've been fought for and expanded by citizens since. And the notion that they're just simply going to be rolled back. I mean, if I look at the history of, I don't mean to say bad words about John Ashcroft, but I don't think he's somebody who believed in democracy particularly before September 11th. I mean, when they passed a law in Missouri, the legislature trying to pass a law to allow the League of Women Voters, which is hardly a radical organization, to register African-American voters, or register voters in St. Louis, which they could do in the counties. He vetoed it. Why? Because those were largely Democratic African-American voters. That is not somebody who believes in democracy. So I look at that and I think, I don't think he wants you to exercise, I don't think he wants us to exercise our democratic rights. And I think that in some ways with September 11th, I'm not saying it didn't, as woman's question earlier, it presents real challenges. There are people out there who wish us ill, and I do want us to be alert, and I do want us to be vigilant. But I also don't want us to use that difficult situation as an excuse to simply say, whatever we say goes, and anybody who questions us is a traitor. Because that really would be taking down our democracy. And I don't think we have to let that happen.
My pleasure. Just make a few announcements here. First of all, Paul, I hate to be the bad guy. This was a very thoughtful talk, and we very much appreciate Paul coming all the way from Seattle on this day to help us think through these things. Very provocative and a very appropriate message. He will be available to answer some more questions if you'd like to stay around, and also his book is available outside in the lobby if you would like some of that. And I do want to mention also, as Paul mentioned, this is going to be broadcast on the public radio station WCVE, and that broadcast date will be October 13th from 7 to 8 p.m. And last, I should also note that this is the first in our series of Jepson Leadership Forum talks this year. So I hope I hope you all have gotten the list and the program for the entire year. But if not, let us know, and we'll be sure to get that in our hands. But join me in one final thank you for Paul's provocative talk.